All right, let's look here at the lower respiratory tract. So right here we'll start with the very lowest part of the larynx, which is then going to lead us into the trachea. So this tube coming down from, now this, we've switched now from a side view to a front view. So imagine this is the neck and the top part of the shoulders. So coming down from the larynx, we now come into the trachea, which you can feel on yourself. If you feel on your neck just at the hard cartilage around your larynx and then walk your fingers down about as far as you can feel the very top part of the trachea. You'll feel some sort of rings here. That's the very top of the trachea. This trachea, if we took a cross-section of it, would look sort of like this. We'd have this partial ring of cartilage with then a sort of a membrane at the back, a soft membrane. So on this diagram, this is posterior. This is toward the back. Back here we actually have the esophagus. It's just behind the trachea. And in the trachea, there's also, on that membrane, there's a smooth muscle here, the trachealis muscle. Anyway, so this cartilage ring helps to protect the trachea and hold it open. So we really never want this trachea to close significantly. We want this to stay open so that air can always pass up and down through this passageway. Now, also worth noting here, the trachea is lined with, actually the trachea and the larynx and going on down here, is lined with this interesting epithelium. A term we sometimes use for it is Pseudostratifiedciliated columnar epithelium. This epithelium has a lot of mucus-producing cells. So it adds mucus to the trachea and the larynx and down here in the bronchi, which traps contaminants and adds more humidity. It is also ciliated, meaning if you looked at the cells that make up this epithelium, they've got these little tiny hairs on them. Microscopic little hairs that are in motion. They are beating and moving the mucus that's on them upward. So this thin layer of mucus that's on this epithelium on the trachea gets pushed upward through the trachea by these cilia. That means that as you breathe in and air is coming in here, particulates and other contaminants in that air get trapped in the mucus and then get gradually swept up to the throat. So switching back briefly to this other diagram, as this contaminated mucus gets brought up the trachea and through the larynx, it ends up here in this area, which then every time you swallow, you take a little bit of that mucus and take it down the esophagus. So those contaminants get swept out, swallowed, and destroyed in the stomach, which is kind of cool. We call that process mucociliary clearance. A way of clearing out contaminants from this area by trapping them in this mucus and then moving them up. Worth noting, those cilia can be damaged, especially cigarette smoke. Cigarette smoke paralyzes and damages the cilia, especially long term. So if you've been smoking for a long time, these cilia are permanently impaired, and the mucus doesn't get cleared out as quickly. It tends to accumulate, which is one of the reasons why long-term smokers often have sort of a hacking cough, especially in the morning when they've been lying down. That's their body trying to use airflow, forced airflow, to move this contaminated mucus up and out. And once it comes up here, back to the other diagram for a moment, once you get that contaminated mucus up here, then you either swallow it or you expel it forcefully through the mouth. In other words, you hock a loogie, I believe is the term. But enough of that rather disgusting idea. And let's get back to this. So we have these rings of cartilage down the trachea. We have this pseudostratified columnar epithelium, which is adding water vapor to this, so we're still humidifying and cleaning it. So by the time the air gets down here to the bottom of the trachea, we've done a lot to prepare it for the lungs, but we're not quite there yet. Here at the very bottom, where this splits off, this is an area called the carina. And then the carina splits into two primary bronchi, a left primary bronchus, that's the singular, and a right primary bronchus here. And those then split off into secondary bronchi, that's a secondary bronchus. Again, bronchi is plural, bronchus is singular. Now, worth noting that once you get past the primary bronchi down into these secondary and then other bronchi, rather than having rings of cartilage, the bronchi, their walls have more of these irregular plates of cartilage. So this is sort of what the bronchi look like. They've got these plates of cartilage on their walls rather than rings. The primary bronchi often still have the cartilaginous rings, but the secondary and then further branches have more of plates than anything else. These bronchi are also lined with the pseudostratified-ciliated columnar epithelium. We'll use its abbreviation. Lined with pseudostratified-ciliated columnar epithelium. Picky! And they have the plates of cartilage. So these are still conducting passages. Their job is still to bring air deeper into the lungs and humidify, clean it, and warm it up. Because they've got that mucous epithelium and the cilia, we're still sweeping contaminants up out of them. Now, when these bronchi, if their lining gets inflamed, then you get bronchitis. And bronchitis is narrowing and inflammation of that bronchial membrane. That narrows the air passage, makes you tend to cough, and makes it a little harder to breathe. Now, from these secondary bronchi, we split off into tertiary bronchi, and so on, into smaller and smaller bronchi. Also worth noting here is that the bronchi are also lined with smooth muscle. So the trachealis smooth muscle up here in the trachea, it contracts sometimes just to narrow the trachea a little bit. You do that sometimes when you're coughing to help improve the flow, speed up the flow of air outward. The smooth muscle down here in the bronchi can also constrict and narrow the air passage. Even more so in a little bit when we get to the bronchioles, but we'll talk about the phenomenon of asthma is one of the things you get when you get contraction in this smooth muscle in the bronchi and bronchioles when you don't want it, which narrows the air passages more than you want and makes it harder to breathe. So, if we go on, these bronchi split up many times into smaller and smaller bits, and eventually they split up into very small, narrow passages called bronchioles. So bronchioles have no cartilage. They just have smooth muscle. And pretty quickly in the bronchioles, you don't have the pseudostratified epithelium. They're really too small for that. If you got a lot of mucus in there, it would clog them up. So these bronchioles are soft-walled passages. They don't have cartilage to hold them open. And their job is mostly to regulate airflow. Sort of like the arterioles do in the circulatory system, these small, smooth muscle-lined passages can regulate whether air is flowing well to different parts of the lungs. So if this bronchiole constricts but this one stays open, this part will get more ventilation than this part. Or you could open that one and constrict that one and divert the airflow here. And as I mentioned, the contraction of the smooth muscle in the bronchioles and bronchi, when that happens when you don't want it and all of them spasm shut, that's when you have an asthma attack. Keep in mind, all of this is still conducting passages, which means that if air only gets here to the bronchioles, we still haven't gotten it anywhere where we can do gas exchange. So if we constrict all of these air passages, we're still preventing ourselves from getting good gas exchange, which is why asthma is a problem. Alrighty, now that we've gotten down through the bronchioles, let's follow this down into the smallest parts of our respiratory system. So now we're going to be getting down into the conducting passages. So we're going to start up here with a bronchiole, one of the smallest bronchioles. We're going to have that split into some even tinier air passages. And then here we're going to start seeing this interesting thing showing up. So, by the time we get down into these very smallest passages, this one might be a respiratory bronchiole. And then these little air sacs are what we call alveoli. One thing you'll notice here is that this is a dead end. There's nothing after the alveoli. This is where the air passage stops. Now, we're going to be talking in some detail about the anatomy of these alveoli, but just to give you a sense of scale here, on this scale, we're down about this being roughly 1 millimeter. So these are microscopic air sacs. Generally, you can't easily see anything smaller than about half a millimeter. So down here, we're talking about just, you wouldn't be able to distinguish the individual alveoli. Now, here in the respiratory bronchioles and the alveoli, we are now in the respiratory passages. These are the areas where we have thin enough walls for gas exchange. And if I looked at blood flow here, what I'd see is that I'd have an arteriole bringing blood to this alveolar cluster, and then it would split up into capillaries that go all over this. So I've got blood flow really surrounding these alveoli in lots of little capillaries. That actually forms our exchange membrane. We'll get to the details on that in a moment, but air coming in here has an opportunity to exchange gases with the blood in these capillaries. And then when we exhale, the air comes back out and we exchange it for new air. So we start seeing these alveoli on the respiratory bronchioles, and then we have the bronchioles split up into things called alveolar ducts, which then feed into these clusters of alveoli, which is where we actually do the gas exchange. So let's take a closer look at one of these alveoli. So this is one alveolus. That's the singular. An alveolus is typically about 200 micrometers across. So that's about 1/5 of a millimeter. So now we're looking at one of these things here. And the wall, there are actually two types of cells in the wall of an alveolus. These long, thin, flat ones are called type 1 alveolar cells. They form the actual wall of the alveolus. These occasional squarish ones, that's a type 2 alveolar cell. Their job is to secrete a chemical called surfactant. We'll get into what surfactant is for in just a moment. So, the alveolus is made of a very, very thin wall with these type 1 cells, interspersed with occasional type 2 alveolar cells. And on the outside, we will have a capillary. So here's a capillary coming along the alveolus. We'll draw a close-up of this in a moment here. So as blood flows along through this capillary, we can do gas exchange between the air and the blood. And we would also have a very thin layer of water on the inside here. I'll draw a slightly more accurate picture of this in a moment. Now, there is another type of cell that you'll find in here. Occasionally, through the small bronchioles in the alveoli, you'll find alveolar macrophages. This is one of these immune cells, which will creep along, finding any contaminants that have or microorganisms that have gotten past all of our mucus and other filters, engulf and digest them and get them out of here. So we keep this area as clean as possible so we get as much gas exchange as we can manage. Okay, so let me draw a better picture of this, and then we'll talk in some detail about exactly what's going on in this area. Okay, here's what I think is maybe a slightly better drawing of this alveolus. So you can see here, as we did before, the type 1 alveolar cells, these big flat, we call squamous cells, and the type 2 alveolar cells that are going to secrete the surfactant. And here, this is roughly to scale, is a capillary. So here, they're actually the red blood cells to show kind of the rough size we're talking about here. Now, I've drawn a close-up of the wall here so you can see more, so we can give you a sense of exactly how thin this is. Because here on this picture, this still makes these cells look too thick. So here what we've got is a close-up where we've got air here and blood plasma here. This is a red blood cell to approximate scale. So these are the endothelial cells that line the capillary. These are endothelium from the blood vessel. This is the type 1 alveolar cell. Here in pink between them is the basal lamina. It's actually shared between the capillary endothelium and the alveolar type 1 cells. They have this common basal lamina, which is collagen but also rich in elastin, in the elastic fibers. So these alveoli are quite stretchy. They're springy. So you can see here that the distance from air to blood is very, very narrow. The total distance here from air to blood is, you're generally talking about somewhere around 0.1 micrometers, or maybe a little more. Maybe as much as maybe up to about half a micrometer. So these type 1 cells can be on the scale of 100 nanometers thick. That's about 0.1 micrometers. 100 nanometers is about 1,000 hydrogen atoms. So here we're talking distances that are really amazingly tiny. This wall is extremely thin, which is what you need for gas exchange. So we've got this thin layer of water on the air side of this. Gases can dissolve into the water, diffuse through these two cells in the basal lamina, and be dissolved in the plasma, where oxygen can jump onto the red blood cells. Carbon dioxide can diffuse from the plasma through these cells in the basal lamina into this water and then come out into the air. So this is where the gas exchange is going to happen. Now, there is something interesting going on here. Let's talk for a moment about how water behaves. So, if you've ever... Now let me start a new drawing here. So take a moment, you can take a look at that. Draw it, and pause it if you need to. Okay. So if you've ever put water, say this is the surface of, say, your freshly waxed car. And we're going to put a bunch of water molecules out here. We're going to spread them out in a thin layer. Now, remember what water molecules do. If I've got two water molecules, they form these hydrogen bonds between the slightly negative oxygen and the... Oops, sorry. These two water molecules form a hydrogen bond between the slightly negative oxygen and the positive hydrogen, which means they tend to jump up onto each other and cluster around each other. If you spread these out in a thin layer, what they will tend to do is build up into clumps. They'll actually move inward, climbing on top of each other, trying to form as much of a droplet as they can. The more of a little sphere they can make, the more hydrogen bonds each water molecule can form to the ones around it. So they will actually jump on top of each other to try to form more of those hydrogen bonds. This is why water on a freshly waxed surface will bead up, form little droplets rather than staying spread out. Now, if you'll go back for just a moment to the drawing we were just doing, as soon as I can find it here. Think about what that's going to mean for the water on this inner surface. We've spread it out into this thin layer, but that water is going to try to clump itself up, which means it's going to try to draw together toward the middle. In fact, if this water is slightly adhered to this surface, it's actually going to try to pull the surface in to form as much of a droplet as it can. That means that in my alveolus, the water is actually pulling the alveolus inward, trying to turn what was an air-filled sac into a droplet of water. The water in your lungs, even though it's necessary for that gas exchange, is also trying to kill you. It's trying to make your lungs collapse down into water-filled sacs. You could talk about this being the surface tension of the water. It's a related idea that water molecules tend to stick to each other and try to clump together. That's why water has a sort of a skin, which you know if you've ever belly flopped onto it. It's also what makes it try to bead up like this. That's actually trying to collapse your lungs. The other thing that's trying to collapse your lungs, going back to this other diagram again for just a moment, is this elastin in this basement membrane. When an alveolus is fully inflated, that elastin is stretched out. So kind of like a blown up balloon, that elastin is pulling inward, trying to cause the alveolus to shrink. So between the surface tension of the water and the elastic recoil of the basal lamina, my alveoli are trying to collapse. Which presents me a problem, because if all of my alveoli collapse, all of the air will be expelled from my lungs and I won't be able to breathe. Now, the elastic tension of the alveoli is not all that great. It's just kind of a weak tendency to pull inward. But the surface tension of the water could potentially be substantial. If we didn't do anything to prevent that, you'd have to constantly be fighting, using the muscles of your chest wall to keep your lungs inflated. Now, fortunately, we can do one thing about that, which is that surfactant produced by the type 2 cells. Surfactant from the type 2 alveolar cells interferes with the bonding between water molecules. So surfactant reduces surface tension. It gets between the water molecules and interferes with their ability to attract each other, which means it's going to reduce, not eliminate, but surfactant will reduce that surface tension. So it makes it so our lungs are less trying to collapse, which makes it much easier to keep them open or to breathe in. Every time you want to inhale, you are trying to stretch the alveoli out. With doing that, you're fighting that surface tension. So surfactant makes it easier to inhale. Without surfactant, it would be very difficult to inhale. In fact, you would always be tending to exhale. This is clinically relevant in a couple of areas. One is in the idea of lung collapse, but we'll get to that in probably the next lecture. In this one, though, this is relevant to premature infants because your lungs don't really start to produce surfactant until somewhere around weeks 18 to 20 of gestation. When you're in utero, your lungs are filled with fluid, amniotic fluid. And so when you're born, in order to breathe, you have to pull on those lungs enough to break that surface tension and allow air to come in. If you are born too early, you may not have enough surfactant in your lungs to reduce that surface tension and allow you to breathe. If you don't have enough surfactant, premature infants' muscles are not strong enough to break that surface tension, and they're going to have a terrible time breathing, which is one of the reasons why infants born very premature often have serious survival challenges. So, we can help with that if an infant is born very premature by a couple of things. We can put artificial surfactant into their lungs, pump it down in there, which then helps break that surface tension and allow them to breathe until their lungs are making their own surfactant. Or we can use air pressure to force the lungs open to help them break that surface tension, to help them breathe until they're a little more mature and their lungs make enough surfactant. One of the ways that doctors can assess whether it's safe to induce a labor in a woman who needs the children to be born, but they're still very young, is by testing the amniotic fluid for surfactant. If the fetus's lungs are producing surfactant, some of it will show up in the amniotic fluid, and that can be a signal that it's getting to be more likely that they'll be able to breathe on their own outside the body. Alrighty. So that pretty much covers what I wanted to talk about in this lecture. In our next lecture, what we're going to get into is the partial pressures and gas exchange between air and blood, and then between blood and tissues. So we'll get to that next time.